has recently came out studying the New York Times and basically their coverage of the Israeli Hamas conflict in Gaza, and sort of found few interesting things about it. Today we're gonna go through a Times of Israel article that was made about this study. Both the article and the study are gonna be in the description, so you can check it out for yourself. Now, just a few things. This one was done by Pinker, a professor and deputy dean at the Yale School of Management. Basically, the way it was done is he analyzed 1,561 New York Times articles about the war published between October 7th, 2023 and June 7th, 2024. And the study was released last month. So, before we go into the article, is there anything else you guys like to bring up, Marco?
Yeah, this to my mind reminds me of the BBC report, the Assison report that we talked about last summer, which prove again, showing the methodology and all the kind of research they did. We showed that there is a massive bias, pro-Israeli bias on the BBC reporting, and I suspect that if you run the same kind of report of research applying to different media, because they're effectively the same thing. They're all stuff made up of progressive, city-dwelling, pro-climate, pro-Marxism, pro-socialism kind of people. They are actually occupying every single position in most of the media. You will find that's the kind of bias that they go down for. That's why you always have the picture of the fat lady in a burqa with a child next to some rebels, and this kind of things goes on forever. So we noticed that before. We keep getting confirmation of it. And to be honest, if you are a normal user of news, if you're a fairly balanced kind of person, you will actually see this bias in action. You will actually recognize yourself that without having to do a scientific exercise.
Yeah, I'll just add it. It's worth pointing out this guy is a Yale professor, but he's not. This is not a report sponsored by Yale. However, it is good even to see that there is a professor somewhere like Yale, even if he's sort of working in his own time, who is doing some good stuff and is obviously analyzing and bringing to light the kind of stuff that we've been bringing to light across all the shows on this channel. So that's good to see. His name is Adil Pinker, his full name, so it's not to be confused with Steven Pinker. And I think we can say a few things down the line, I'm sure, about the way in which statistical analysis is done and what's good or what's bad about that, and what's necessary to have a full picture of anything analyzed, and that being just one of the methods of doing it. I'm sure we can talk about that aspect of it, but let's have some cheer for the fact that we can talk about somebody who is actually doing some good stuff, and it's good to highlight him for that.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
And the credibility of the Washington Post and the New York Times should be completely obliterated by this. I mean, these are institutions that built their name and I don't get into the new media, old media world, but the study demonstrated that the coverage, and this is their words now, fit a specific narrative that basically portrayed Israel as the violent aggressor. Very little mention of any Israeli hostages, Palestinian violence, or Israeli casualties after those initial Hamas attacks. So, didn't their thing used to be all the news that's fit to print? I mean, they specifically exclude the news to perpetrate this fantasy that Israel was the aggressor and that Hamas and the Palestinians were these poor victims of mean old Israel once again.
Now, we'll go to the article so we can cover more of it. Something I should mention, when the professor went into sort of researching this, he said he was not out to sort of prove there is a bias. He was just interested. And also he said it's really hard to prove a bias. What he was saying is more of a line to something like, even if you're not biased, if you put a certain picture to your readers, and that was also one of his big point. If someone is just reading the New York Times or even just non-Israeli media, even if there was no intention of bias, if what you walk away is you only hear about the Palestinian casualties, you only hear about the stories on the Palestinian side, you walk away with basically saying, okay, I think at the end of the article, which I'm not sure if we'll get to, so I'll mention it, I think the New York sorry, the Times of Israel person has said something. It's almost as if Israel is just fighting civilians and shadows. Basically, the way the sort of you walk, if you look at the data, sort of the thing you walk away. But let's go to
and
the.
Dr. I'll just quickly saying, Dr. Peikoff has that wonderful article, which our audience should go check out, called "A Picture Is Not an Argument." But that's the argument that the New York Times and many others have put. Just pictures of poor Palestinians, victims of mean old Israel, no context at all. And of course, they can't show you the Israeli hostages because most of them are skin and bones and underground like animals and tunnels as it is. When we find them in those UNRWA tunnels or civilian built tunnels. So Israel is just consistently portrayed as the bad guy, and there's no sense of what's just either. They say Israel killed this many people. Well, where was that just? Maybe that wasn't enough. So this study reflected a culture that hates the good for being the good, and the good is Israel in this case.
So let's go to the actual article. So the title is New York Times downplays Israeli post-October 7 losses, Hamas role in the war. The data study says. Research by Yale professor says newspaper minimizes Palestinian violence following Hamas attack on Israel, leaving readers with a distorted view of the conflict. New York Times coverage of the Gaza war downplayed Israeli losses incurred after October 7, 2023, Hamas invasion of Israel, and minimized the role of Palestinian violence in perpetuating the conflict, according to a Yale professor's analysis. Adil Pinker, a professor and deputy dean at the Yale School of Management, analyzed 1,561 New York Times articles about the war published between October 7, 2023 and June 7, 2024 for the study released last month. The coverage fit into a specific narrative. The study said that narrative said that Hamas carried out a brutal assault on Israelis, mostly civilians, but that after that attack, Israel was the sole aggressor and bore few costs from the war, aside from declining international support. And I think this is the first place I sort of want to stop in, because imagine when you discuss what's happening in Gaza, I think context is very important, because because of the sort of inequality between the might of Israel and Hamas, obviously there's going to be much more casualties on the Hamas side. Now, many of them are terrorists, and many of them, unfortunately, might be civilians, which Hamas is hiding behind, or sort of, even children, which are fully innocent, not even on the sort of civilian side. But when you cover that, there has to be some context. You have to even as I think in newspaper, you pretty much have to continuously remind this was started by Hamas. Hamas is the one not surrendering, not giving back hostages, not surrendering to Israel, is a terrorist organization, and that's sort of a thing that keeps that has to be reminded, that if you only cover if you only cover the sort of the casualties or what's happening from day to day, I think you're dropping the massive amount of context that I think goes beyond sort of like what should be like an objective reporting. But Marco, what do you make of this first part?
Well, yeah, as the author of the report says, he doesn't want to talk about bias, of course, because that would expose him to lots of criticism and deviate the attention from what we're actually saying. But what we can easily say this is bias. Creating a narrative means trying to skew the opinion of the readers. So it's creating a bias in favor of the Palestinians. And it's quite interesting that there is this, in parallel with the actual war, with the military actions that Israel is taking, there is a propaganda war against Israel itself. We've seen it for last year, actually playing out, year and a half, playing out in the West. And it's all designed to support the Palestinian side and to try and create conditions where the international opinion, most people's opinion, is against Israelis actions, Israeli defense. Effectively, they're trying to make the Israeli state impossible to perform its duty of protecting its own citizens by coming up with this kind of environment, the climate where they're pictured as the bad people, the people who shouldn't react just because they got bombs, they got military, active military and effective military that they've developed. They shouldn't use it because that's unfair. The Palestinians are just a bunch of savages who attack Israel regularly. Even today, by the way, there was a rocket thrown by Gaza, which of course fell into Gaza itself. But we don't talk about that in the West because that would show what kind of people the Palestinians are, what kind of people the Gazans are, and how the Gazans actually could choose to just give up the Hamas fighters. And instead, what do we see when the hostages are released? We see all the baboons in the black mask and the RPGs and the rifles or whatever jumping around. So
and promising that they're going to be back for more. Listen to these guys that Israel releases, and the first thing they say is, "I can't wait to go kill more Jews."
Yeah, and with them, they always have kids because effectively they are trying to teach the next generation on how to behave, how to kill Jews. Look at us, we are so powerful. We can sway the opinion of the world. But the problem is that the casualties. I mean, it's not a matter of numbers anymore. One casualty, one person injured on the Israeli side by the attack from the Palestinians is enough to justify Israel to do what it's done. The only duty, and I use the word duty in a particular context here, for a state is to protect its own citizens. So the moment a citizen is injured by any party, it's the state's duty to get rid, eliminate the force that caused that particular attack. Now, we know what happens on October 7th. We know how many thousand Israelis were butchered, and we know that 250 hostages were held, and they're still held. So a rational, fair media outlet would remind every single day that the Palestinians are still holding hostages and using them as exchange currency in order to get back their terrorists. So every time any news outlet or institution talks about the Palestinians suffering, well, they willfully ignore the side which is the real victim, the people who are still held by the captive, and they never ask for them, for the people who caused this atrocity in the first place, to give up, to put down the weapon, surrender, and stop the fight.
Yeah, and also just to jump in, even when it comes to suffering, that is also contextual. I mean, imagine if 2 years into Second World War, we started talking about the plight of the German people, or basically that I mean, Japanese people were starving at the end of the Second World War, like actually on the brink of starvation, not what we have been hearing about Gaza. Now we understood the context of they declared war on us, and they are suffering the consequences of those actions, and we have to finish it. Yet that's not what's happening here. Jonathan?
Daniel, I have to jump in. I mean, I'm reading about the bombing of Dresden, 1945, joint British and American aerial bombing of the city of Dresden. 25,000 people were killed. And how many Americans were like, "Oh no, the poor people of Dresden." They wanted them dead because they wanted the war over. They wanted them to feel it. And that is the point of war, to finish it, to win the war. Miss Rand talked about this ad infinitum. It was written about by John David Lewis in Nothing Less Than Victory. But all that Israel's done, from keeping the lights and energy on to the hostage negotiation, it's emboldened Hamas. It said, keep hanging on. You're gonna be rewarded, and they have been rewarded. And that's what's just so infuriating by the whole ugliness of it, and the promise that it's going to continue. We are going to see hostages galore anywhere in Europe, potentially the United States, and God knows in Israel and Tel Aviv. Get ready for hostage galore, thanks to this bullshit. Excuse my French.
Yeah, and this sort of thing is still continuing. Now, there has been some sort of move when it comes to the hostage release on Saturday. Now, it has been changing like every hour, so I have no idea what it's looking right now. First, Hamas has said they will release 3 hostages, but they were supposed to release 9. Then Israel said, no, you have to release 9 on or all. Then Israel backed down. So again, I have no idea what's happening now there. But we see the same thing. Like again, this is like again, Hamas has hostages, and Israel has to negotiate for even having the deal that they have already done to sort of have it be enforced, like the fact that 9 hostages were supposed to be released. And again, the sort of the scenario is still that in the West, we do want a ceasefire. We do want this deal goes through, despite the fact that Hamas has been breaking it at all times, despite the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which again should be like reminded every single time.
And Daniel, I'll just say I don't want to dominate, but the deal gives more fodder to the New York Times. We all knew that Israel was really the bad guy in here. That's why they're giving up, 1,000 freedom fighters for 3 friggin' 19-year-old girls that were at a festival. Freedom fighters, right? The ones promising that they're going to bring hell and brimstone on the next Jew that they happen to come across. So, Israel participating in this charade gives more fuel to the altruism globally, and the New York Times and Washington Post in particular to paint Israel. We all knew they were the bad guy from the get-go.
Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to bias, for example, I think that's one of the key things that I think he's a little bit off the mark on, because I think we can identify bias very clearly here. But also the fact that you don't need to have a dry set of statistics in order to be objective. You can be objective about what's good and bad, what's morally right and wrong, just by looking at the evidence in front of your eyes and understanding the cause and effect. And I think a lot of what we see here, a lot of this compartmentalization that goes on when people write the narratives they write, which separates October the 7th off into its own little bubble, to be talked about it only within the bubble of the brutal Hamas on that day alone, and then talks about everything else as if it's got no connection to it, and is purely Israeli aggression. That's trying to sever cause and effect. And again, if you look at some of the releases of hostages with those horrible propaganda setups that Hamas do, when you see people on the stage, and you also see, as Marco pointed out, the kids in the crowd in their green bandanas, the kids being trained as Hamas, the next generation of Hamas. And the point is that you never see those kids on the normal bias narrative that you see within the New York Times or the BBC. You see them as kids without their bandanas standing in the rubble. But what you should see is this as well. And some of the narrative that's given for some of the arguments that the New York Times put forward should be overlaid with these images of these actual kids being trained as Hamas fighters, and treating Hamas as their heroes. Because go ahead.
No, and let's see like some equivalent kids in Israel who, my guess, are at some kind of summer camp, learning how to build something, learning how to do agriculture, learning how to be little business people. I mean, I think back to what Miss Ayn Rand told Donahue when she was asked about, I think it was referred to as the Arab situation in the late 1970s. And if Razi was here, he'd quote it for me, but I think of it all the time because she described them as savages who haven't changed in years, who resent, and I'm paraphrasing now, who resented Israel for bringing modernity and reason and capitalism and progress to the Middle East. And now it's 30 plus 40 years on, and look at Israel. It is this amazing metropolis, skyscrapers, Nobel Prizes, incredible technology, standard of living that's equivalent to anywhere in the West, and some of the most expensive, fabulous property. And so much of the Arab world, to Miss Rand's point, haven't changed a bit. They're sending over their stupid balloon condoms, hoping to pick off an innocent Israeli at a festival somewhere, because their ideas haven't changed. And, that's why that's one of the reasons I don't care about the so-called bias or care about the so-called casualties.
Yeah.
FAFO, and they haven't found out just yet, my opinion.
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. She says, "Thank you for justified anger, Jonathan." Absolutely. Let's read a little bit more from the article. So, continuing, the coverage following the Hamas attack instead focused on Palestinian suffering, portraying Palestinians as passive victims whose suffering grows daily. There was extensive coverage of Israeli violence, but less mention of Israeli hostages, Hamas casualties, Palestinian violence, Israeli casualties after the Hamas attack, and Israeli suffering that was not directly tied to October 7. Little mention is made of Israeli casualties post October 7 or of Palestinian acts of violence post October 7, even as Israel and Hamas were locked in intensive combat over the 8 months of the study period, the study said. Now, going to the actual numbers, so the total articles again was 1,561, the articles that were studied uh, in that period that the study looked at, and among those, 1,423 have not mentioned October 7th victims post October 7th or death of Hamas fighters. Now, if you take Israeli numbers, the civilian to military ratio should be about 1 to 1 to 2 to 1, basically, potentially up to 2 civilians per like military target. Now, this doesn't seem like it's true according to the New York Times. Basically, they have much more covered everything, all the Palestinian casualties, Palestinian specifically civilian casualties, but not specifically military casualties. Now, this might be from a few reasons. The fact that Hamas doesn't release military sort of casualties, they just release this is just the Palestinians that are dying, and oftentimes it is the Hamas numbers are being taken and are being assumed all of those are civilians, but many of those either half or at the very least 1/3 or half or potentially even more are military casualties, which again, but that is something when it comes to sort of reporting, that is something that you can say in a report. You can say these are the Hamas numbers, many of them are military casualties. You don't have to say these are all civilians. You don't have to even keep the ambiguity that, oh, we don't know who this is. Like, you have to put things in context as a media company.
Right. I mean, and lost in all of this too is that Israel is not fighting a war of aggression. If Hamas waved the white flag, the Palestinians waved the white flag, Israel, believe me, would put down their weapons. They don't want to occupy. They don't want to devastate. They don't want to level. Actually, most Israelis that I've met give a shit about human life, care about human life. But Hamas and the Palestinians haven't done it yet. They have not waved the white flag. They have not released the hostages. They have kept it going. And they've done it on the backs of the New York Times and those that painted them as freedom fighters and, honest brokers and people who can be dealt with. But, as Marco and Richard just even quietly illuminated to the horrors, that took place that precipitated this entire conflict. And Miss Rand writes about it in The Nature of Government. What's the purpose of government? Is to keep you safe. How safe are you if you live just a couple of miles, a couple of kilometers away from literal savages who cannot wait to break in and slit your throat, slit your kid's throat, take them back to be hostages? And, Dr. Binswanger has a line which I use quite a bit, which is the threat of force is force. It is not right to have to live next to people who are plotting and trying every day to send rockets over, kidnap people, shoot you. That's not Israel. That's the Palestinians, and that's Hamas. And that's why every single one of these deaths is on their back and justified by Israel.
Yeah, I mean, Marco, what do you make of the disparity between how much? Now I can bring it up. So I said 1,423 articles that did not mention Israeli casualties post October 7th or death of Hamas fighters. Now that means only 140 articles in total mention it, and now 278 articles did not mention Palestinian casualties. Now that's about like 20% of all articles that were released did not mention Palestinian casualties. compared to about 90% on the Israeli side. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, it's part of the narrative. If you start showing the actual numbers, people will be able to make up their own mind. They can see who's the victim and who's the attacker, really. At the same time, the term casualty itself is irrelevant. As you mentioned earlier on, most of the Palestinians are terrorists. Palestine itself, again, is not a people. It's not a gene in terms of population and ethnicity. It's just a political movement. And what they do, they're doing exactly what they're designed to do, i.e., oppose the existence of Israel as such. So all their actions are designed to either kill Jews or destroy the state itself. And of course, they fight. The Hamas people, the Palestinians, the Gazans fight in civilian clothes, which, by the way, is a breach of international laws. The very laws that all these New York Times media and their readers are so fond of when it comes to denunciate Israel. But they ignore this. They ignore all the single events and facts which are not conducive to their narrative because they have a narrative. And the narrative, let's stand by the side of the uncivilized against the civilized. And even the concept of suffering. If it's the enemy of civilization who's suffering, first of all, I don't give a crap because they deserve it. They started, so they deserve to live with the consequences of the action that they themselves have taken, and that they themselves could actually stop at the drop of a hat. But when I see the suffering on the side of the people who are the actual victims, the hostages and the people butchered, and by the way, the family of the surviving hostages, which are constantly tortured by the Gazans, when they show images of the loved people under condition of giving out the sign that they're still alive. So the family are still hoping that they might come back, and they are tortured on a constant basis by thinking, the people we love are kept captive by the savages and they're still alive, so they're probably still suffering. And it's a continuous psychological torture is perpetrated by the Gazans. And of course, the fact that the casualties and the victims are used as a propaganda tool in itself is a massive drop of context. Yes, people die, but why do they die? Well, some people die because they are attackers, some people die because they're defending themselves, and some people are just killed because they're the victim of the actions of the attackers. So this is important to remember what's going on here. This is a civilized society in the Middle East among uncivilized people who's trying to defend its own citizens. And the rest of the so-called civilized world, which should be ours, should actually realize that, should actually put the support behind the civilized side against the people who want to spread more hate and ignorance and go back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I think. Go on, Jonathan. You look like you wanted to speak.
Yeah, I'll just echo and what do they say? Re-up and encourage people to check out Miss Rand. She was asked, if you mean whose side should one be on, Israel, the Arabs? I would certainly say Israel, she told the audience member, because it is the advanced, technological, civilized country amidst a group of almost totally primitive savages who have not changed for years and who are racist and who resent Israel because it brings the industry and intelligence and modern technology into their stagnation. It was 1979. Has that changed at all? Only that Israel's gotten even more impressive, grown. I mean, it's become really a place of incredible science and advancements in technology and everything. And so much of the Arab world, it's like it's been asleep for decades.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to mention also, there is no even desire to westernize, no desire to liberate, to be more free. I mean, you cannot, something we might cover in the upcoming days is the sort of Ukraine conflict. And I got reminded of an article from a few weeks ago in Slovakia where someone said, when the war ends, we sort of will stop idolizing Ukraine. And big part of it is like Ukrainian system is really corrupt. Ukraine is in a really bad state as a country, and it has to be something that has to be reminded. But what sort of separates Ukraine at the very least from Russia is the fact that they do want to be better. They do want to westernize. They do want to be more closely aligned with Western values, with freedom, with democratic values, and all that, which is not present in Russia and is absolutely not present in the Middle East. Even if there was a single nation in Middle East that wanted to be more prosperous, wanted to be more Western, there would be something we could work with. But there's not a single one. They want to stay like this. They want to keep hating Israel. They want to stay either a theocracy or monarchies or basically statist nations, and there is no movement for something better. Even when Arab Spring happened, it was just we just wanted a different kind of dictators, not the ones we have right now.
And I have to say, just isn't it amazing, someone who analyzes companies and industries and sectors and the global economy, the wealth where reason exists, where freedom exists, where, I don't know, women can drive a car, where modernity exists, you have a tremendous wealth creation. I mean, Israel's so prosperous, not even within the context of the Middle East, but among major U.S., Western, European cities. And it's not because it's what do they say? It's the Jewish state. It's not their religion that has prompted all that wealth creation. It's their secular reason and adherence to the protection of individual rights to the extent that they do that. So they are, I used to say on Fox all the time that the Middle East, when you look at it, it's such a cesspool, ex-Israel. And Israel shines like a beacon because of it and how much wealth has been created there. And why the New York Times is on the side of the savages to this day, or someone in the super chat, the barbarians. I mean, is it just altruism? Israel's so wealthy, we've got to kind of be on the side of the underdog. I mean, they started it. They created it. They're the aggressors and they're in the wrong.
And when we're praising Israel for its industry, for its ability to generate wealth, and for its citizens to thrive, I think as a part of that, we should also praise the military side of it, and we should do so with some pride. Not with the shame that having a big military is a bad thing. A big military is necessary to protect the individual rights of your citizens, particularly when you're utterly surrounded by aggressors. And clearly, with things like the Iron Dome, now we obviously speak about how the Iron Dome often distorts the morality of how Israel fights these wars, but nevertheless, the technology in itself is an incredible technology, as is David Sling and all the other things that they're bringing online in the future, and that should be praised as well. But of course, what we're also led to believe through this stupid narrative, which really doesn't work when you analyze it for 1 second, is that Israel has this really impressive military, and that on the other side are only, and I mean only, civilians of women and children. And yet they've been unable to beat these women and children in the rubble across 15 or 16 months. That's what we're led to believe. Which is utterly ridiculous. It shows the extent to which not only is Israel not fighting in the way it should be, but also the extent to which Hamas has been airbrushed out of this whole picture, of this whole narrative. The way in which Hamas does fight is totally absent from this. And it's that downplaying and absence of it from the photographs, from the narrative, from the reports of casualties, from the explanation as to how they build tunnels, how they use facilities. And of course, when we're looking at the pictures of them on hostage release day, they are in their parade wear then. When they're wearing all their like ninja gear with the green bandana on, that's for PR purposes. But when they're fighting, they're hiding behind the women and the hospitals, even though those hospitals, of course, also contain some of their own supporters, also contain some of their own Hamas part-time members, and so they're not innocent in that respect either.
And when Israel came in defensively to try to rescue some of the hostages that were being held amongst Palestinian civilians, did everyone just cool it and like go for a walk? Did everyone just kind of hide in the basement and wait to think? No, they attacked those choppers. They attacked the Israelis, just trying to rescue the civilians to get them out of there. So, you know, I have very little Rahmanis. Somebody might want to do a Google search of what that means. Very little Rahmanis for the Palestinian people who enable, who embolden, and who have Hamas represent them to this day. And if we saw more white flags waving, if we saw more laying down of arms, I might have a little more empathy. But we don't see any of that, and I have none.
And that's not through passivity, because you look at the passivity they, showed on October the 7th, they were fully complicit, those Palestinian civilians, and cheering it on and participating in making sure that it was as violent and hideous as it was. And I just want to make a comment about October the 7th and how I see it covered endlessly in many of these articles, because one of the things with the statistical analysis that focuses on whether something is mentioned or not, what it doesn't bring to light is how it's mentioned and the prominence it's given and the emphasis it's put within an article. If you simply has, as the BBC is prone to do in particular, a small paragraph, 3/4 of the way down, which is a stock set of words, like your boring phone T's and C's, which nobody ever reads, about how many people died on October the 7th, and those kind of statistics, which is designed to be skipped over but contractually included. That is deliberately designed to make people not read it, not notice it, even if it is there. And of course, it's again designed to separate it off into its own little bubble, so you don't focus on it, so you don't recognize that that's what caused what you're seeing subsequently, and that's why Israel should be fighting stronger. But at least it's making some good progress.
Yeah, that sort of narrative reminds me of I've been getting into investment for some time now, and when you have like someone saying, okay, this thing it's gonna 5x in the like next few days, you have to buy it now, but this is not an investment advice. It's like, come on, like that statement has like no meaning in the context of it, and it's similar when you keep talking about how about the personal stories of Palestinians, how they are suffering, how Israel is imposing siege, how it's not delivering humanitarian aid, how many Palestinians have died throughout this war, and at the end you mention, well, but some people, some Jews died on October 7th. It's like you might mention it, but it's erasing, or it's that statement is automatically erased when you start with the other part. But let's read
And
a
it's
bit
also,
more. Yep.
sorry, it's also the use of the words suffering. Any civilized person in the West that sees the word suffering already recoils, because suffering is not a good thing. But the Palestinians, they love death, they celebrate death. So to them, suffering is a virtue. For us, is a disvalue. For them, is a value, something that they want to achieve, something they want to reach. Martyrdom today, dying for the cause of killing Jews, is a good thing. So when they suffer, actually, they're not suffering. They're happy because they're achieving their goals. That's why they push their children in front of the bombs. That's why they use hospital, humanitarian places that are designed to help people to actually fight a war. They hate life, and they do exactly what people who hate life would do. They destroy and kill.
Can I make one observation too? I mean, I believe now that these hostages, including still, I believe some American hostages, have been held now for longer than the Iranian embassy siege from 1980, that period of time where those hostages were held. And when I was growing up as a kid, that was held out as the ultimate humiliation of Americans who were, being held against their will, being held at gunpoint by these totally, I mean, I'll reserve my words just for now, but it was seen as this tremendous embarrassment for America, that Americans were being held that long. And the fact that Americans and Israelis continue to be held down, going on a year plus, like it legitimizes, as I said, it legitimizes hostages as something that is seen as a legitimate means of discourse in the world. Because when you take them, you get respect. You get to sit down. You get to have your little parade where you all with your little masks on and you parade these poor girls out there and taunt them. I mean, it's such propaganda win for them that it's the net long-term impact, is so astronomical. And of course, believe me, the New York Times and the Washington Post will be covering every moment of it.
Let's continue reading a bit more. So continuing with the article, the study was published last month in SSRN, a platform for working research papers that have not yet been peer-reviewed. The study was not sponsored by Yale. Pinker has a background in data analysis and has previously studied demographics in U.S. Jewish communities. The New York Times is regularly criticized by both Israel's supporters and its detractors for its coverage of the conflict, including before the start of the latest war. The study said it was not looking to prove bias in the reporting because bias is statistically difficult to determine, and evidence of an editorial slant would need to take journalists' intent into account. Israel is also relatively open to journalists, unlike Gaza, where the authoritarian Hamas rules suppress dissent and reporting. The different levels of access impact coverage and could create unintentional bias, the study said. So just a part about the bias and why they mention it is, I think, because, yeah, statistically, when it comes to bias, it is like a state of mind you have to do, while sort of like undermining parts of what's happening could be as a result of like an actual, like, you just make a mistake and you cover something much more, as they've said, when it comes to the fact that Israel is open when it comes to news. When Israel is doing something, we know about it. We know because Israel is regularly sort of telling us what it's doing, how it's doing, and what's happening wrong, and is apologizing when something happens wrong. This is not something you have in Hamas. This is not something you have with terrorist organizations or authoritarian countries, because they do not care about what the journalists think. They do not care to be transparent because they do not have anybody to sort of what you say, basically someone that oversights them. They do not have anything like that. While Western
I'll just
nations
say,
do.
and how many other journalists have we found over the last year also happen to have a couple of weapons and maybe have been participating in some of the, you know, you know, attacks on Israel over the years? The
Yeah,
Al Jazeera journalists who happen to also participate in some of that, as I recall.
Yeah, I mean, I think, was it a few weeks ago when we covered the Washington Post coverage of the prisoners that were released, and the way they've covered it is, Israel has released teachers, journalists, students, and all that, but they've released terrorists who did teach, who were journalists, and who, were students, but they were actual terrorists. They were people who were caught on October 7th. They just, I'm not even remember who the first person who came up with this, but say, yeah, they had day jobs. Yeah, terrorists also have a day jobs because Hamas is embedded. It's the government. So of course, Hamas members are gonna be the teachers. Hamas members are gonna be the journalists. And the fact that you would look at the terrorists and focus on the journalist part of them and not the terrorist part, I think again tells a lot. But this was the Washington Post, not the New York Times. So, yeah, I mean, Marco, would you, anything to add on this part?
Well, I mean, the bias is hard to prove because you have to prove intent, but that's just a legalese way of making sure the guy doesn't get sued if he says
Well,
this.
I just repair him because he said with just the numbers,
Sure.
basically, because he the only thing he's pretty much looking at is the numbers and nothing else.
Absolutely. I mean, but even if you did a qualitative analysis, you find it very hard to prove intent, partially because the philosophy behind in our society is very much dominated by altruism, by the fact that by equity, by hating effectively the success, and therefore feeling automatically on the side of the Palestinians, just because the feeling that they are the on the weakest side, that they are the underdog, that they are, oh, look at them, they are among rubble. So they must be more innocent than the Israeli. And this is all part of the emotionalism that these media companies are whipping up. Because if you make people think on an emotional level, just as Jonathan mentioned, the peak of lecture about the picture is not an argument. If you make them feel that those people are oppressed, if they make them feel like they're suffering, well, then they bypass their rational judgment with what they feel, with what they've been effectively forced to react to. So they stop judging morally. They stop thinking, hang on a second, why am I seeing these images? And they just focus on what they see, and they don't see what's behind it. It's a perfect cover for whatever agenda you want to push. If you make people behave on an emotional level, you automatically wipe out any reasoning. And that's why they use this kind of personal cases of, oh, look, this child has lost their parents, not mentioning that the parents are terrorists. Or look, these children are being killed, not mentioning that the children were actually fighters because Hamas uses children to fight. So all this kind of tricks that pulls on the heartstring of the westernized people who love life, who decries the loss of life, especially for somebody who in our settings would be an innocent person. Of course, they're used in a very vicious way, and just for propaganda purposes.
I think one of the things we haven't covered in the course of this, and is not covered by this guy in this particular report, is the fact that different languages are used to show different narratives to different groups. And particularly, obviously, we have covered this on these shows before, but like Al Jazeera, for example, when it's in its Arabic context, speaking Arabic is talking directly to the hardcore Islamic, those that follow Islam in accordance with the full extent of Islam, not a Western version of it, and therefore they are really focused on the anti-Jewish element of it, but only to their own audience. And then when they swing across into the English version of Al Jazeera, they're directing it at their second tier of supporters in the BBC, in the New York Times, to recycle those arguments and to exploit the altruism of the West against itself. And that is clearly the way it works. Now, that won't be covered in the course of this kind of statistical analysis. But of course, one of the things that you do notice is how when they do have those two things cross over, and they cross over visually in those hostage releases, where you're suddenly reminded in a near lynching of some women, some Israeli women hostages being released. That's a sudden reminder of what happened on October the 7th and how those women were dragged into Gaza in the first place. And suddenly that's a PR disaster from a Hamas point of view, because you're suddenly showing to both the Western world and, of course, your own supporters that it was Gazans and Hamas who were brutally treating these women, and of course all those that died as well. So it's that's when you really becomes clear what's going on. You can't treat October the 7th, as they do in many of these articles, as some isolated aberration that wasn't representative of the actual ideology, which is there all the time. It wasn't a one-day event that was different to everything else. It was the epitome of and representative of every day before and since. And that within that context, you can't separate it off and pretend that you can treat that differently. And of course, that gets behind the philosophy and its subsequent psychology that is behind the ideology here that we're talking about. So, and how the people, the Palestinians and Hamas really are, and that's what we need to bring to light. And this helps. This certainly helps to do that, because some people do need to see things in a pure. They do prefer to see some sort of statistical analysis which backs up, but it can only ever corroborate what is the true narrative bias picture, which you can see for yourself when you analyze the actual cause and effect that's taking place across all of what we're looking at.
But the compounded impact, gents, of the New York Times, of Piers Morgan, of all of this media, my sense is, and I don't really know a lot of 20, 30 somethings necessarily, but if you ask most college kids, 20 somethings, 30 somethings, their thing would be, well, the Palestinians are oppressed, and these are really freedom fighters. And Israel is a racist, imperial country that, along with America, has capitalism and imperialism at its roots. And like this, that, maybe I'm overselling a little bit, but I really do think that is what's been taught in Columbia. That's been what's taught at Harvard, and why most Americans, most young people especially, have every sympathy for the Palestinians and none for the real victims in this, the Israeli and the Israel and the Israeli people.
Yeah, and also something that is important when it comes to sort of any sort of analysis of any conflict or any set of facts or any sort of narrative is philosophy is required. You need some form of philosophy, you need some form of thinking to be able to evaluate a situation. And when you have someone who, as you said, just keeps on saying, well, Palestine, it's the Palestinians are oppressed. It's they deserve a right to self-determination, and you have no understanding what is the sort of the philosophy of rights, the what makes a country good, what makes defense needed, justified, what are rights. If you have no understanding of any of this, then it's very easy for the New York Times to come in and pretty much just put on a narrative, and you sort of eat it up, or you sort of just take it over by osmosis, because you have no other means of thinking about this. Thank
Well,
you,
and it's
PC.
part of, I have to say, it's part of what we're doing in the Ayn Rand Center UK's. Ayn Rand and objectivism is the only radical perspective on all of these issues. And, people said, oh my God, she was a radical when she called, the Arabs savages back in the 80s. Like, there's so much of that. If you avail yourself to some of Miss Rand's fiction or nonfiction, be inspired by it. We encourage you to pick it up. And that's what we're doing here. And we can only do it with our super chatters and with our monthly subscribers. We thank you.
We have a super chat from PC. Thank you so much. He says that paper is bias fact. That paper is bias. I'm not sure what you mean specifically by that. And we have a super chat from Mary. Thank you so much. We could go further into the article. They go over also. They go over some of the numbers. I'll put the article in the description, as well as the full paper. It's not that long. I think it's only about a couple dozen of pages, with most of them just being sources, so people can check it out. But I'll just say I'll just put out one line from the study, and then I'll go to you guys for some last words. At the end of the study, it says, from New York Times perspective, Israeli soldiers are mainly fighting civilians or shadows, and that is the sort of thing you go away with if you really look at the numbers, because it very rarely mention Hamas, both Hamas, the actions that Hamas has been doing, such as the rockets, such as the attacks, such as the different attacks on either civilians or IDF soldiers. And what you mostly see is the fact that Palestinians are dying. You don't see any distinction between civilians and militants. You only see Palestinians are dying, and you assume it's civilians. And that's sort of the thing that has been happening in New York Times. And now, we've talked about the bias. If it's really not biased and it's accidental, then they should look at it and say, okay, what have we been doing wrong? And if it's a bias, then nothing's really going to change. But yeah, Marco, any last thoughts on this topic, and also where can people find you?
Yeah, and it's not only the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza have been fighting Israel for the last year and a half. It's also in the West Bank. Every day there is a terrorist attack. Every day there is a car ramming against IDF soldiers. So these innocent people are actually actively fighting a war with Israel, and they've been doing it for the last 80 years. These attack rockets and suicide bombings and all this kind of stuff has been going on since the very start of the state of Israel, because they just don't want it. And talk about ideas. Earlier on, you mentioned the fact that we don't know how Israel will react to the next, to the announcement from Hamas. Well, Of course, we don't know how they're going to react because they do not know how they're going to react. And that's what happens when you are taking a pragmatic approach. If you don't act by principle, you never know what your next move will be because it's all an ad hoc try and cover this base and cover the other base and make this happy and trying to make people think that you're doing the right thing. So they never follow the principle that you should just protect individual rights and the action to follow will be dictated by that. Stick to your principles, and you will know which action to take, and the action you take will be much more effective than a protracted war that goes on trying to appease the Palestinian, try to appease international community, appease the U.S. administration. If Israel went out there just with the intention of protecting his own citizen, they would have got rid of Hamas in November 23. So we wouldn't be here at this stage. And of course, the other side, the Islamists, are very, very consistent in following their own ideology. That's why for the last 80 years, they've been attacking and destroying and trying to kill Jews, because all they care about is death, destruction, and spreading their medieval ideology. And that's what happens with secure principles. You will be successful eventually because nothing deviates you from your goal. The goal is death, and that's exactly what they're achieving. Just look at earlier on today, there was another Islamic attack in Germany, another of a long series of Islamic attacks in Europe. And this is becoming so regular because this ideology is being spread in the name of multiculturalism.
I just wanted to read out one quote from the excuse me, from the author of this report and to make just a quick comment on it. He said this in the course of the report. He said, "If you really want to understand what's going on in the war, you have to understand how the main parties are experiencing it." Now, I would urge a lot of caution with that particular quote because I think that brings up a lot of problems because you don't want to just replace pictures of Palestinian women's crying over their children with pictures of Israelis crying over their lost ones in the course of October the 7th or rocket attack or what's happened since. And you don't want to compare one set of numbers with another set of numbers, because if you're doing either of those things, then it's just a competition between who can outcry or outcount the other side. That will tell you nothing about the morality of what's involved. In fact, that will lead you towards a moral equivalency, which is precisely what you're trying to avoid. So in order to get the good and the bad, to understand what's morally right and morally wrong, which side is defending individual rights and defending its people, that's the key element to unpicking this. So whilst I think it's important to highlight when newspapers and media coverage is not representing the amount some of the actual events that are taking place and are simply airbrushing them out of existence, that is clearly wrong. We need to highlight that, but it doesn't mean you should interpret the whole war through a lens of trying to elevate Israeli suffering in terms of the coverage. What you should be focusing on is how to resolve the conflict with a firm, quick finish to the war, regardless of the number of Palestinian or Hamas casualties that it takes in order to bring it to an end once and for all, and not be in this perpetual war situation another 5-10 years down the line.
Jonathan?
Well, it just brings me back to Miss Rand's comments about the importance of ideas and how basic ideas are really what move the world. And, Israel on this tiny little, strip of land in the Middle East as a haven for reason, reality, science, technology, advancement, freedom of speech, freedom of women and homosexuality, and all the things synonymous with modernity and the incredible wealth that is born as a result of it. And just across the bay there, just down the block, if you will, old ideas, Islamist ideas, mystical ideas, and just how many more generations. I think of it very selfishly, like wouldn't you have been psyched to have been born as a Japanese excuse me, not a Japanese American, as a Japanese, and so 1950 as opposed to 1930? Wouldn't you have been happy? I know I am, to be born into a society that protects individual rights, that protects freedom. All of us have some semblance of that, and some semblance. I feel just terrible for another generation when I see those young kids, those young Palestinian kids with they're not even mock guns. They give these kids little real guns to shake around, and it's like another generation, 2, 3, 4 generations, it's all about ideas. And my hope is that instead of that little kid having an AK, we can get them a copy of Atlas Shrugged, we can get them a copy of We the Living, we can get them a copy of a new textbook of Americanism, something from Ayn Rand that can begin a real renaissance fueled by Israel, but supported by objectivism in the Middle East. That's my hope.
Any other book you'd like to promote?
Yes, I do. You know, I have a book called The Pit, chronicles my period of time as a trader on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. It's called The Pit. It's available at Amazon and definitely different from anything you've heard today, and make a great gift for someone who's into the stock market in your life.
Marco, where can people find you?
You can check out the sister channel to this one on YouTube, The Briefly Objective, and check out also Ayn Rand Center UK's Substack.
And with that, thank you guys for joining me today. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of The Daily Objective and The Reality Show. Bye-bye.
Bye.